Right, so I'm Andrew Hattersley. I'm one of the members of the Biobank Access Committee, but I'm here today to help with the session about genetics. And I think for many people, you kind of think, well, why is Biobank doing genetics? And a lot of our ideas about genetics are based on the idea these are things which are fixed, which we can do nothing about, so how does that help us to actually improve health, to just find out about genetics if we can't change them? So what we're going to try and do in this session is explain initially what is the importance of genetic research in improving health, and then we're going to hear some of the future plans. And then we'll have some questions to take for anything that you've got to ask, anything in this area at all. Now, I'm going to start at trying to understand genetics because it's not completely easy. So basically, every single one of you has got 3 billion bits of genetic code. And that's about the number of words in a library. And they're actually organized into chromosomes, which are like the bookcases in the library, and then there are genes which are like the books in the library. But at the end of the day, it gets down to knowing what the individual words are like. And that's what we call the base, and that's the genetic code, is these words. And when you've given your samples to allow them to be looked at, what we're doing is we're looking at that bit of genetic code. And if you have a genetic disease, what we typically, things like cystic fibrosis, which is caused by a single gene, then what happens there is just one of those 3 billion bits of code gets changed, and as a result of that spelling mistake, you get such a bad book that it throws the whole body out and you get a disease. So this is what happens with genetic disease, and so genetic researchers looking for this will search through the whole library to try and find the one misspelt word. But this kind of disease, Biobank is not great for. Although we've got 500,000 people, some genetic conditions will only affect 1.5 million people. So it's not a very efficient way to study this kind of work. And actually, what we're going to talk about mainly is not rare genetic disease where the spelling mistake causes the disease. What we're going to talk about is what is a lot more common. And that is that the genetics don't make you have the disease, but they predispose you to it. And what that means is that you have what we call common variants. And just to give you an idea of going back to the library, this is like American spellings. They're pretty annoying, but you can cope with one or two. But once you get enough of them, you start to lose the meaning and you start to have problems. But if I find one American spelling, I don't throw it out, I can cope. And that's exactly what our bodies are like. And so what we're doing with the initial genetic studies is really looking at these variants that aren't bad on their own, but just in combination can predispose you. And often it's the genetic susceptibility is working along with other things in the environment. And that's what we're trying to understand. And this is what most common conditions are like. Things like diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, depression, schizophrenia. All of these tend to be polygenic, so it's a genetic predisposition, and there's lots of it. And what I'd like to do is to try and show what Biobank is doing and how it's helping. So really there are 3 things you can do. You can define the genetic susceptibility to a common disease, you can define the genetic susceptibility to a trait or a characteristic, and then you can use genetics to understand relationships. And I'll just go through an example of each of those. So the first one is designing genetic susceptibility to common disease. Because there's 500,000 people in Biobank, that means there's 30,000 people with type 2 diabetes. And that means because you're in this study and because the DNA and the fact that you've got diabetes is available to researchers, means there are now 30,000 new patients to go into genetic studies. Now, to just give you an idea, I spent 10 years of my life collecting 3,000 patients with type 2 diabetes, and I did it with 6 other centres. And that was a massive study, and in 2007 we were really pleased when the first genetic study was done of that many people, because it was a big, big study. And even now, if you put all the genetic studies together from throughout the world, with all the researchers coming together, their numbers are around 30,000. So at a stroke, Biobank is doubling the number of people in the studies. And what that means is, whilst our first study with only 3,000 could only find 6 variants, now we've got about 30,000, we can find 121 of these variants of these American spellings. You may think, well, is that really that helpful? Each one on its own isn't that important. But just to tell you about one of the variants that we've now been able to find is a variant in the LDL receptor. Now, the LDL receptor alters your cholesterol, your bad cholesterol, your LDL cholesterol. And that what says how likely you are to have a heart attack or a stroke. Not surprisingly, a genetic variant that alters LDL greatly affects your risk of getting diabetes. So it actually lowers your risk. This one that lowers the cholesterol lowers your risk of a heart attack down to 22%. So that's very strong evidence that lowering LDL will reduce heart attacks. But what is surprising is this same variant also increases your risk of diabetes. So you've got one thing that's lowering your heart and increasing diabetes. And this is really important, because there have been studies about people on statins which say when you take a statin which lowers your LDL, 2 things happen. One is you're greatly more likely to live, because you won't get a stroke or a heart attack, but you are slightly more likely to get diabetes. So the idea was, can we make a drug that just gives you the benefits without the disbenefits? But what this tells us is we can't, because it's the LDL lowering that actually is the cause of the diabetes. So we can't separate those 2 things, which stops drug companies spending millions of pounds trying to develop a drug that separates them. So just a very minor result like that, which has only had a 3% increased risk if you have this one, has really helped us understand. And that's really what genetics is doing, is improving understanding. So if we go on and think about the traits, these are all those things they measured when they saw you. Some of them you kind of think are pretty obvious and medical, like BMI, how heavy you are, or your blood pressure. Those are things we know predispose us to disease. So to understand the genetics behind those makes a lot of sense. But there are other non-conventional ones. You were asked about your sleep duration. What has that got to do with medicine? And you could actually have it with your activity monitors. We could measure your sleep on that more accurately. And Mike Whedon has just done a study on the first 120,000 people and found that he could find genetic variants that predispose to how long you slept, and also if you're a morning person or an evening person. Now, who would have thought that was had genetic determinants? And that doesn't sound like an obvious health thing, but it can really help. And the reason for that is that sleep duration is associated with obesity. So if people work on shift work, they're more likely to be obese than if they don't. But there could be many ways that that happens. One of the things is it could be that actually disrupting your sleep makes you obese. The other possibility is you could be obese and that could disrupt your sleep. And it would make a big difference if you wanted to try and sort this out, knowing which one of those 2 it was. So because Mike Whedon found the genes predisposing to sleep deprivation duration, he was then able to ask, do those go with obesity? So the idea would be, you genetically have things that alter your sleep. Do they then alter your obesity? And the answer was they don't. And so it doesn't look as if sleep duration is causally making you obese. So it's understanding those relationships. And there are other examples of that. So this one is something you may kind of picked up a bit, which is that household income is related to obesity. Two possible ways for that. One is that people who have more money are able to buy better food, and so therefore they eat better and they avoid obesity because of their wealth. There is another possible explanation, which is that if you are overweight and obese, you can't get such a good job because of you being overweight, and you are prejudiced against in our society. So can we just have a show of hands? How many people think it's because people eat bad food? Put your hand up now. So it's because people who have less money get bad food, or the other way is that we prejudice against people. So I think we had a majority there going for that people that get less money buy less good food. What we can do is, if we know the genetics for obesity, we can actually, the genetics for obesity won't be altered by how much you earn. So that's something you're born with, is how genetically likely you are to be obese. And if you're genetically likely to be obese, does that go with income? So this was the question. You've got these variants that make you more obese, and does that go with your income? If it did go with your income, it would suggest that actually it was being obese that meant you earned less, rather than the other way around. And the result from Tim Frayling's study was very striking. What it showed was for each genetic stone in weight, it had an effect of over £3,000 in your salary. So this is what we see here. This is but it was only in women. So it wasn't in men. So you can be a fat cat and have a big salary, but if you're a woman, then for each genetic risk of obesity, it's 1,500 for each stone. I got that wrong. So what that means is that if you want to try and sort out obesity at a public health level, this kind of information is absolutely vital. Because this means you have to fight prejudice and deal with the obesity in a different way, rather than just going out and trying to subsidize healthy food. So understanding the relationship between things that go together, and it can come up with unexpected answers. And for me, this is the really exciting bit about genetics. It's using it to understand other data, things we've known for a long time, but now because of Biobank, because of the numbers involved, we can start to dissect things. So really, understanding this polygenic susceptibility is absolutely vital, and over the next few projects and things, we'll hear about two things. One is new projects, but also new data. So, thank you.